Good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to this CIPFA webinar, Decision Making in a VUCA Environment. I'm Vivian Russell, I'm Head of Communications and Content at CIPFA, and I'm going to be moderating today's discussion. So this is one of a series of webinars CIPFA is hosting, where we're examining a range of issues for public finance professionals that are emanating from the current pandemic. So we're looking at issues from the professional and technical right through to the personal. And so today we're taking a look at VUCA. If you're not familiar with the acronym, it stands for volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous, or volatility, uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity. And probably something that most would agree, it reflects the current climate quite well. Organisations grappling with the fallout from COVID-19 do need leaders who can make decisions in a VUCA environment. So this morning we're going to be exploring how leaders might approach the challenge, what success looks like, and actually whether VUCA is actually the best acronym out there. Before I introduce our two speakers, I just want to remind everyone that we want this to be an interactive event. So this is an opportunity for you to put your questions and comments forward to our panel and for them to respond and discuss. You're able to submit a question via the question panel on the GoToWebinar dashboard that you should have on your screen. And once the presentations have concluded, I will put those forward to our speakers. Just to say, you can put a question forward at any time you like. There's no need to wait until the end of the presentations. So to discuss VUCA today, I'm delighted to introduce two great speakers. We have Benjamin Taylor, who is Chief Executive of the Public Service Transformation Academy, and he's also a Managing Partner at Red Quadrant. And then we also have Brendan McCarran, a veteran of CIPFA webinars. He's a senior consultant here at CIPFA, and he leads our CFO Leadership Academy. So I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, who is Benjamin. Benjamin, over to you.
Thanks very much, Viv. It's an honour to be here, and I must say I'm looking a bit less smart than I did in my profile pic there after over 100 days of lockdown. I have many affiliations, as you can see, and I would very much welcome connections and follow-up and conversation about these issues. The ones that seem to be relevant are I lead the Public Service Transformation Academy, a systems and complexity practitioner charity I'm on the board of, consultancy Red Quadrant. I'm writing a book about this stuff for Routledge, and part of a movement called Requisite Agility. How can we be sufficiently agile in our organisations to meet the challenges of the environment, which is really what today is all about. Just checking that I can click through. It looks like it's working. Viv mentioned, perhaps even just in the interest of pronounceability, most of the time what people are talking about when they use the acronym VUCA is simply, gosh, aren't things difficult? There's a lot to deal with. I slightly prefer tuna. I do like a bit of tuna, but what we're talking about here is, rather than volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous, which is a military term for operating in febrile, challenging conditions, there's this built-in narrative of everything is accelerating and the way we work needs to change. That narrative has been going for at least 80 years, and it may have been true the whole time, but it's probably not the point. The point is probably how can we be adequate to the conditions that we face. I prefer tuna, turbulent, uncertain, novel, and ambiguous, because that for me categorizes for the sorts of organizations that we're involved in public services. And I should say all my work for the last 22 years has been public service focused and public service change focused. I think those are the relevant conditions, and they talk to the same fundamental underlying challenge that not only do we not know exactly how to deal with the circumstances, but also nobody knows, and we may not even know after we've been through them. This phrase, tuna, was coined by Rafael Ramirez at the Oxford Said Business School. It's well worth looking up. It does say that in my slides. So just slightly to make the point, we entered the Second World War with prop biplanes, and we ended the Second World War with jet fighters and nuclear weapons. So volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, or tuna are not new conditions. And there is a lot of good stuff out there from the previous century and even before. So it's not as though we need wisdom that's brand new. It's just that we need the wisdom that suits our needs right now. I'm saying that there are really 4 dimensions of what we're trying to deal with. Wicked, messy, complex problems in the world that threaten to slip through to absolute chaos. And or those of you who've been running around with the multiple challenges of responding to the COVID, which is a situation which is probably most of us, will recognize some of that. The fact that we are in heavily integrated systems where suppliers, partners, citizens and communities have to be considered part of the scope that we have to work with, manage, engage with, is another factor. Somebody, when they move the mouse, it seems to take the control away from me temporarily. So whoever's moving the other mouse, perhaps it'd be helpful if you couldn't, if you didn't. The fact that organizations themselves do not respond to our command. I've been in so many meetings when councillors and leaders and politicians want a control panel where they can sit like at the deck of the Star Trek spaceship and pull levers and control things. Actually, that isn't what works in our organizations, particularly given these other conditions. So directive controlling management is insufficient for the circumstances, I would say. People like to make a boogeyman out of the concept of command and control. Command and control was developed specifically for VUCA conditions, and what it really means technically is creating the maximum autonomy of the front line that's consistent with the wholeness of the organization, with the organization hanging together. And what we really mean when we say command and control usually is people wanting to have all the answers and taking all the decisions into the center. Pressure is increasing and resources are decreasing. We've been in more than 10 years now of grinding austerity, which hasn't changed really in any dimensions. It looked like there was, for a brief moment there, in response to COVID, that was going to be changed, but no, we're back where we are. So it's generally an oh shit moment, and never been a more appropriate time for this meme. People would love to ignore the VUCA or tuna conditions, and the problem is that trying to snap back to the way that you know best that has worked in the past is a recipe for just this kind of situation. So what can you do? I've picked up 5 themes. Brendan's got some other very different and powerful insights to add. I say play on a bigger stage. Try to think about the system of interest, the area you're trying to intervene to get better outcomes, be defined by the citizen and community, not defined by your organizational boundaries, constrained but not defined by your legal responsibilities. So take responsibility for the real results in the world, the bigger thing, the bigger picture. Play both loose and tight, lead as the conditions demand, and I'll get into some of these definitions. What I mean by that is sometimes you need to be very, very controlling and directive, and sometimes you need to be very dispersive and empowering, and we saw a lot of that in these incredible first responses to COVID. Understand that you need to meet human needs. People are emotionally impacted by tuna and by the circumstances. I like tuna as well because it undermines the pomposity of people like me talking about VUCA. Meet organizational needs. That means you need to be able to make sense what the heck is going on at an operational and a strategic level. You need to manage the signals from the world. That means you need to narrow down, attenuate what's not important and amplify what is important. And you need to have really good communication, change and adaptation within the organization. So it's really minute-to-minute learning that you need to pick up and move to transformational. I'm going to try and summarize those in the 9 minutes that I have left, and we may come back to some of them. Play on a bigger stage. Fundamentally, the outcomes that our citizens and communities experience are the results of complex adaptive systems. We talk about this in delivering the Cabinet Office Commissioning Academy through the PSTA, that there's this shift from innocence, well, I do my job and it's not my fault, I did my job perfectly, it's not my fault that the outcomes were absolutely terrible, from putting ourselves at the center, imagining we are the ones creating the system with our services and our money, to humility and decentering ourselves, understanding we're just small influencers who could have a big impact, but we're just part of a much bigger system. Moving from a service focus to an outcomes focus, lots of councils have jumped in and created community hubs and set up accreditation and distribution systems when the community was doing it already. And I think that's really quite an interesting learning point. And move from separation. Here it says commissioning and service design. I mean policy and delivery. Forget those separations in the chain from decision through to action. Understand that you have a shared responsibility. We talk about there being 5 worlds, and this is a gross oversimplification, as most models are. We make sense, we understand things differently, depending whether we're in citizen world where we live our lives, service world where we're trying to deal with the influx of demand, management world where we're trying to make the whole organization hang together and be a recognizable whole, leadership world where we're trying to direct and create the culture, set the conditions, and the world of learning and change where we spend far too little time, especially at moments of crisis. Moving on to the second response, play loose and tight. What do I mean by that? I mean that understand that there are fundamentally 2 types of challenges going on here. There are technical problems that you solve with expertise and power, where you bring in somebody with enough experience, enough budget, there's enough time, and within 10 to 15% of time and budget, they can get through step 1 to 1087 of their Gantt chart and deliver. So, the setup of the Nightingale hospitals was a fantastic achievement. The public inquiry will determine whether it was the right thing to do and what the actual impacts were, but it was a technical problem really well solved, and it didn't solve anybody's view of the world. It was heroic activity that everybody could applaud, and it was done well. However, that's contrasted with complexity, and truly, I'm just blurring all the technical definitions, don't worry about that. Adaptive, wicked, messy social problems. There we don't quite know the goal. We're likely to be part of the problems in leadership. We need an adaptive approach, and really true progress is the only thing that counts. So, we're through the phase, and thank God, of needing in the same way the Nightingale hospitals and the urgency of getting respirators. But we're now into the truly complex situation of how do we communicate and set understanding so that people respect physical distancing and make sure that that actually makes a difference, and monitor and share the information about reinfection rate, about infection rates, etc. So just to give you a clue, if any of these indicators come up on the right-hand side, it's a recurring problem. People might get hurt. People would rather avoid the issue. That's a hint that you are dealing with a wicked, complex, messy type of problem. Fundamentally, to get more power, you need to give up control. You need to disperse information across the system, take it in very quickly, share it out very quickly, just exactly as what's not happening with the tier 2 infection data at the moment, if you're following the case of Leicester and the other areas that may go into local lockdown. And what we're really trying to generate is the discretionary effort of citizens and communities. That's the most powerful thing you can do. Make people make the effort to wear a mask, to distance, etc. Sorry if I'm talking just about COVID, but this also applies to childhood obesity, to getting people fit and healthy, to all of the kind of challenges that we see in public policy and delivery. We need to recognize and tell people and frame where we've got complex problems and where we've got technical, and the two get wrapped up together. We need to be really, really good at collaborating, because if we're just stuck in our organizational boundaries, how are we affecting that big and complex system? No, we have to work as a partnership, as a team, and we have to be really, really honest and really, really clear in our communications. On the other hand, those are all the sort of motherhood and apple pie, right? Everybody can agree with that. Very, very nice. What it also means to me, and some more motherhood and apple pies, is do your good listening. Acknowledge, give yourself the benefit of understanding, and give your team the benefit of understanding you don't have all the answers. Ask good questions, and everything is about co-design with the people who are affected. So this is all the nice stuff. What I also say is that we need really clear and effective value-adding hierarchy to deal with complexity. We need some people to be able to be heads down, boom, 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 deal with the operational challenges, work with the people, co-design, create the local outcomes on the ground. And we need people looking at the big picture, and we need them to be communicating and working and adding value together, collaborating and co-creating. Everybody needs to know clear boundaries that should be the right boundaries that give them the freedom to really act with discretion, knowing that they're not going to step over and mess up some other part of what we're trying to achieve to achieve our public service outcomes. You need really clear accountability. You need people to be able to explain and give account for what they're doing. And you need just the right amount of planning. In complexity, you can't plan step 1 to 1087, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't think about the future, plan for what you need to get in place, and anticipate. We also need to pay attention to meeting human needs. Sorry, this is a busy slide. All of these will go around to participants afterwards, and I'm happy to follow up with any questions. My point here is that as humans, we need a degree of certainty and comfort and a degree of uncertainty and variety. We need love, connection, and belonging, and we need to feel significant and unique. And it turns out that these same human needs, if they're allowed to be expressed honestly, actually give us what we need as organizations to deal with volatile environments. Certainty and comfort gives us enough sameness for the organization to cohere. Uncertainty and variety gives us differentiation and the ability to adapt. Love, connection, and belonging gives us integration and mutual support in the organization. And significance gives us that autonomy and people bringing their whole self, which we need. So we need a zestful balance of all 4 of those things. In our practical work on the ground with public service leaders across local government and beyond, we have these 5 practices that we introduce, and these are things that you practice, you make part of your daily practice that you are not good at to start with, but you can get better at. They are very simple. Honest conversations, get at the reasoning behind people's arguments, get at the emotions, open up the undiscussable. Clarity of relationships, of boundaries, of roles, of tasks. Learning, and I'll come to that in a minute. Building a productive culture, focusing deliberately on a culture where people can really give their discretionary efforts, and having a good and clear intent, actually measuring on the ground and focusing your organization on delivering what matters to citizens. So the next step in my recommendation for how to deal with VUCA is understand organizational needs. A little story here about, this is from Carl Weick's book, Sense Making, a detachment of Hungarian troops who were on military maneuvers in the Swiss Alps. They sent out 3 team members on patrol, and then a huge, terrible winter storm came down, and for 2 days the troops were missing, and the commander suffered terribly, thinking that he'd sent them out to their death in the cold. And then on the dawn of the 3rd day, those troops, bedraggled and miserable and cold, arrived back in the camp, and everybody celebrated, and they said, "How did you survive?" And they said, "Well, we thought we were lost when the storm came down and we lost some of our equipment. We hunkered down in a little shelter, and then one of us found a map in his pocket, and we've discovered that with the aid of this map, just as in the moments when the weather cleared, we could find our way back to camp, and we were saved." So naturally, they gathered round and they took out this miraculous map, and they looked at it, and they discovered that it was a map of the Hungarian Alps, not the Swiss Alps. So the point here is, don't assume that we have basic stability going on here. Think and orient in ways which allow us to adapt to the circumstances, but understand that we need some kind of map and some kind of approach to think about how we can proceed. 3 horizons is a very useful concept. This basically says there are 3 realities going on at once in this kind of tuna conditions. We have Horizon 1, which is the old world slowly fading away. Horizon 3, which is the new, better world that we'd like to pull through and identify what is it that's happening at the moment, that green line that we can amplify, that we can build on. And we have this messy middle of Horizon 2 with innovations that keep Horizon 1 going and innovations that open up the possibility of pulling us through to Horizon 3. I won't talk to this slide, it's just to say that really what we're trying to do in tuna conditions or VUCA conditions is understand and make sense of the change in the environment, quickly orient to what it means for us, make real decisions about what we need to do to change and push that through to the operations at the front line. Final point, we need to bootstrap our learning, and we need to be able to go from the insight that we're getting from the interaction with citizens or in a hospital at the front line very, very quickly up to the highest levels of policy and strategy and our approach. So fundamentally, there's this concept called triple loop learning. If our identity, what we think is our job and our belonging, shapes our thinking, which shapes our actions, which shapes our results, then there are 3 levels of learning that are possible, and in a crisis, in VUCA conditions, in urgency, in tuna, they are all the more important. And so first is changing our behavior, right? So macho firefighters back in the, whenever, you know, firefighting began as a profession, the 18th century or 17th century, got better and better at fighting fires, pulling people out of burning buildings and saving them, right? That's the single loop learning, improving our actions. Over time, they began to reframe their thinking, and they thought, wouldn't it be better if we stopped fires going up in the first place, right? So there's a second loop of learning going on there. And as that job shifted and they became more and more about checking the batteries in smoke alarms in old people's homes and thinking, well, we could save them from accidental house fires, but we can also save them from CO2 poisoning, look for slips and trips. The identity changed away from just being firefighters who are very good at the heroic work to understanding that it's the slow, patient community engagement work. And that's one reason why when we do work, you know, across areas and place-based leadership, we often find that the fire service are some of the best at engaging and partnering. And that's because over time, their profession has been very clear about this triple loop of learning. So that's all from me. I'm very happy to follow up and connect. I think I may have gone a couple of minutes over, sorry, Viv, but I look forward to hearing questions afterwards, and I look forward to hearing Brendan now.
Thank you, Benjamin. That was really, really fascinating, rich, sort of thought-provoking presentation. I don't worry too much about the timekeeping. There's only 2 speakers today, so hopefully we'll have plenty of time to hear Brendan and take some questions and discussions towards the end. So I am going to hand over to our next speaker in a minute, Brendan McCarran. Brendan is a senior leadership and professional consultant for CIPFA Consultancy and Training. He leads CIPFA's CFO Leadership Academy in the UK and for the Government of Canada, and is heavily involved in CIPFA's finance, business, partnering world and in change management assignments in the UK and in Europe. Brendan, over to you.
Thanks, Viv, and thank you, Benjamin, for that presentation. So I thought we'd come at this at a slightly different angle, in that I'm interested in the how do you make personal decisions. So if you are a leader, what should you do? So rather than look at it as a collective, I'm looking at this really as an individual thing. So a few thoughts really about individuals making decisions. So if I go and start with my simple complexity model, which those of you saw me talk a week ago, and indeed anyone seen me talk in the last 15 years, I normally draw this on a board somewhere in answer to any kind of question or to address any kind of consultancy problem. It's very simple. It says the world is made up of 2 types of problems, type 1 and type 2 type problems. Type 1 are the ones that Benjamin characterized there as a fairly straightforward technical problem, the Gantt chart approach problem, and type 2 is the stuff that's much more in the realms of complexity. It's much more difficult to pin down, if you recall. Now, the point about this is that any given problem is a mixture of the 2. So when you start your career, you tend to be faced pretty much with only the type 1 aspect of the problem. And as your career progresses, you move toward the right-hand side, so that the problem boundary is now pretty much all red, a little bit of blue left at the top. The most important factor, I think, is that we sometimes overestimate what is complex and what isn't, or rather we mistake what is complex and what isn't. And so we apply the wrong kind of thinking and the wrong kind of problem-solving approaches. So if it's straightforward, technical, then a technical solution is required. If it's complex, then a technical solution isn't going to work, for the simple reason that most of these sort of type 2 type problems, no one agrees what the problem is, let alone what the solution is. We can see all the political shenanigans going on at the moment. You name it. It's a position where one group of people at least think one thing and another group of people at least think another thing. And so they're not going to agree on the problem, let alone on what any solution might look like. And that's very typical of a type 2 problem. So what we're looking at here is something about type 1ness and type 2ness mixed together, and they're not, of course, as distinct as this little graph shows. Somebody the other week said, can you put some dimensions on it? So sometimes I do, and I would put a dimension that says C going up, and that's really for capability of dealing with ambiguity and uncertainty, and T over there is how long it takes to solve the problem. So if you've got problems that take several years to solve potentially, then you're probably indicating that it's probably on this right-hand side. If it takes seconds to solve the problem or to understand the problem and to get from the problem to solution, it's probably very simple. But that also means that as you progress up your career, you've got to be jolly good at dealing with ambiguity, which is the characteristic of leaders who get to the top of organizations. You can get people who are excellent project managers at the top of organizations, but really the people who do well, who lead those organizations, I think, and most of you will recognize this in yourself, is that you're able to cope with ambiguity that you couldn't cope with in your early 20s when you entered the workplace. You thought there was certainty. If only you got to the next level, that certainty would be there for you to see everything. You'd be like Ozymandias, you could see the whole world before you. But as you got up to your next level, you found out you couldn't. Welcome to the world of ambiguity and senior leadership. So that's the context of working in. I think we're having to make decisions in that world. So let's look at what I mean by VUCA. Oh, by the way, if you really want to know the easy way of figuring it out, the blue stuff, the type 1, there's predictability and cause and effect there. In the red stuff, there's probably no predictability and not much in the way of cause and effect. So moving on, what do we mean by VUCA, and how would I rewrite it? I'd rewrite it and resequence it. So I think it's about, in making decisions in these circumstances, about vision, what I call unity here, analysis, and courage. So an overlap with some of the things we talked about last time when we were talking about resilience, really. Vision, what does that mean? Well, we need to have some kind of vision. So as an organization, something, a statement, we help these people solve these problems in these ways, whatever it is, some kind of story or narrative that people can understand. And the reason that's important is that then when we work back from the future, where the vision is, to the present, then we can orientate. It gives us a sense of direction, it's inspirational, it's a signal, it's about what the organization is about, what we should be part of. And of course, also, it's a basis for measurement. And I put measurement in inverted commas there because it's not measuring us directly necessarily, but it's about gauging whether or not this is the right thing to do. So without a vision, there's a bit of a problem. Why is it a bit of a problem? Well, if, for instance, you were in a sort of old fashioned sort of boat, and you had a lee shore, so on the right-hand side, that green thing is a cliff, and you were sort of on a rocky old storm, you don't need a vision for that situation, because all you need to know, everyone on that ship needs to know, is how to get off the rocks. That's all we need to do in the moment. We don't need any great vision. The vision, the importance of vision comes because where the future is intangible, where it's very difficult for people on the deck, as it were, to understand what's going on. Then they need some kind of vision. So they've managed to fight their ship off the lee shore, and here we are in the middle of the ocean. Where do we go from here, boss? What are we trying to achieve? What are we as a group? Where are we trying to add value? How do we gauge ourselves in the world? That's what I mean by a vision. So whatever you want to call it, you need some kind of sense of direction, sense of purpose. And I think that's the first thing. Whenever we're making a decision, think about what our purpose is here. Think about what we're trying to achieve. Once we've got that clear, then we can actually make sure that the decisions we're making and the way we're approaching those decisions are going to be useful in adding some value. Lots of decisions that are made for expedient reasons, and they end up not being terribly expedient. Often because what we're doing is treating the type 2 nature of the problem as if it was type 1. So as Benjamin pointed out, putting up lots of Nightingale hospitals, fantastic. Yeah, I bow to no one in my admiration for the people putting them up, as Benjamin says, but whether or not they're the right thing to do, we don't know. Luckily, it was peanuts. It didn't cost anything. and it didn't take resources particularly away from anything else, so it really doesn't matter. And in fact, maybe it was a good thing in terms of morale at the time. But we won't know that. And it might be that actually that could have cost a lot of money. The opportunity cost of all the resources used there could have drawn a resource from somewhere else. Who knows? Second bit is unity. This is about actually me trying to crush into the acronym VUCA, the idea that we need to actually keep an eye on what's going on in the world and enrich our knowledge about the situation we're trying to deal with. I think in Benjamin's terms, this is looking out, standing out from the world, or looking from the outside in. I have a very simple picture. It's a normal distribution curve, and this is about the population's knowledge, or at least their perspective on anything you care to mention. So it could be their perspective on Formula One motor racing. It could be their perspective on underage pregnancy. It could be their perspective on whether or not we should invite overseas Hong Kongese to live in Britain. Any kind of subject matter. There's going to be a difference of perspective over the population. Common knowledge is going to be the majority view. The thing is that common knowledge quite often is not terribly useful knowledge because it is so common. It's already built into the fabric of the way we think, the fabric of the systems. If we're going to do something different, we need to be looking for less common knowledge. And in fact, actually, probably what we need to do is looking for the rarest knowledge, looking for those perspectives at the ends of the tails of the distribution, not the stuff in the middle. The stuff in the middle is known, it's in textbooks, it's in guidances. The stuff at the end perhaps is new. It's a completely different perspective. It might be the wrong perspective, but it triggers ideas. And so what we have to be doing is constantly be looking. Who was the Bismarck, the little Prussian down there, the quotation that everybody knows from Bismarck, or most people know only one quotation from Bismarck, I suppose, is that only fools learn from experience. And what he meant, of course, was that he followed it up by saying, I learn from the experience of others. And so it's indirect experience. You can't possibly know all the opinions of the population. You can't possibly live their lives. You can't have their experience. But what you can do, of course, is you can constantly be looking for that knowledge by indirectly observing them, talking to them, reading books, watching things, listening, networking. In all cases, what we need to be doing is learning about the situation. So it's how much are we reaching out to have different perspectives on what's going on? How much are we picking up this other people's experience? It is not foolish, it's not weak to, as Benjamin said, ask questions, but it's not weak or foolish to be wanting to learn new things. I find one of the most amazing things I find is that, and it's to do with the way we work at such an intensity these days, is that people do not keep up their professional training, training beyond the minimum CPD requirements of their profession. So it's not necessarily with accountancy or personnel or economics. It's in all kind of fields. People do the absolute minimum to keep up. And yet, a friend of mine who's a GP, and he's a lot younger than I am, so he's been out of his college practice for about 15 years. He reckons that half the stuff he was taught 15 years ago is completely being superseded by new knowledge, new ways of working. So the half-life of knowledge in medicine and being a GP is 15 years. And so he has to constantly be on the front foot. He has to be constantly learning, but he can't learn just by himself, just by his own experience. He has to be constantly looking at journals. He has to be constantly networking with colleagues. He has to be constantly attending or listening to conferences, whatever it is, to keep on his learning going. But so few professionals outside medicine do that. We don't really reflect on what we've learned. We don't actually encourage learning in others. And I find that very interesting. It makes my job incredibly easy, because when you tell someone something, it's actually completely new to them. They've never heard it before. And yet it's I would have thought, common knowledge. The second thing is analysis. This is tied very neatly into that first one, and in fact, it's based on, I suppose, in the same sort of way as Benjamin's triple loop learning. We see stuff, we then think about stuff, and then as a result of thinking about stuff, we go and do stuff. This is also in those of you who are real fans of VUCA, go and look at a guy called Boyd, B-O-Y-D. Put Boyd into Google and you'll get endless information on how Boyd sees the world or saw the world. So that's how we make decisions. We see the world, we see a situation, and we take information away from that. We take some data and we think about it. The trouble is, of course, we only notice what sustains us. Nietzsche said we don't believe what is true, we believe what sustains us. So what that means is we are very selective in what we see. Once we have the information, then we're very narrow in the way in which we make decisions. So our decision-making systems are set up very early in our careers, maybe very early in our lifetimes. So we favor a particular way of working. We favor a particular kind of way of gathering information and making those decisions. And what tends to happen is that sometimes we're successful. And when we're successful, we think, great, it must have been our decision-making process. And so we apply that decision-making process to lots of other things, and we may not be so successful, but we kind of ignore that. So we're really selective. And in fact, when we make the decisions, we either file or forget, or we kind of look for confirmation or to justify whatever decision we've made. We are incredibly self-referential. How does this show itself? Well, it shows itself because it gets worse and worse as we go on, because of course what happens is if our decisions are apparently to us fantastic decisions, then that means that it affects what we see, it affects the data we pick up. If we think our thinking processes are fantastic, then that will affect what we see, what we pick up. So it becomes actually a kind of vicious circle. How do we break away from that? Well, it's like the previous slide in a way, like looking for unity in the population. We need to think about the sources, the viewpoints, the disciplines that we invite to the party. If I'm thinking about making a decision, I look for advisors. I shouldn't always be looking for the same advisors. Certainly, it's interesting these days to think about generational advisors. That means thinking about people, the age profile of the people in the room. One of the things I do is a lot of work around business cases and cost benefits analysis. And I look at economists and I gauge their age, and I have a chat to the economists and I say, okay, when did you do your degree? And if they say they did their degree sometime in the last century, we have an interesting conversation, because in the last century, cost benefits analysis training at university level was different from the way it's done now. So they have an entirely different view. So if you've got younger economists and older economists, you get different kinds of advice. So sources, viewpoints, disciplines, think about that. Think about the techniques of decision making. I do a lot of work at the moment with international bodies. So international bodies go everywhere, mixed groups, police, military, ambassadors, politicians, all kinds of people sitting in a room making decisions. And it's amazing, they will use the same approach to make a really, really complex type 2 type decision or to approach that problem as some of the really simple stuff to do with hiring people. And it's because they have, as I said before, in terms of thinking, they've alighted on something that worked for them when they were in a much more type 1 type post, when the stuff they were dealing with was much more straightforward. They could see the results of whether or not they did something right or wrong fairly quickly. And that kind of reinforced that this is the only decision-making approach we should use. The other approach actually is when you get experienced politicians, particularly when you get people who've been in really senior positions like ex-presidents or something and are now running some kind of mission, is they see everything as a really complex problem. So everything has to be sitting around singing Kumbaya before you make the decision, even though it's a really simple decision you're making. So appropriateness of the decision-making system, and there are reams of information available on how to think about your decision-making system, getting the heuristics right, getting your rules of thumb right, challenging the environment. And of course, don't get me started on motivations of people. I mean, it's we really need to think about why people are making the decisions that they're making. I was just reading Basil Littlehart. Benjamin was talking about information from the last century. He was the great military historian. He talks about the way that generals or people who've got a sight of getting to be a general, they bottle up their objections, they bottle up any doubts they have about the system, and they say to themselves, when I get to the top, it'll be all right, I'll sort it out. And then what happens? Littlehart says, when they open the bottle, the vapor is gone, there's nothing left. They become the same general they hated before. They become that same narrow-minded individual, making self-deceiving decisions. I'm sure that doesn't happen anymore. This is about challenge. And the final point is, of course, our brain deceives us. One of the things that ways you can do this is by looking at simple tricks. Here's a simple question. A bat and a ball cost £1.10 in total. The bat costs £1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Now, you can look up the answer if you like. I'm not going to tell you the answer for the moment. You can figure it out, and you're probably having a little battle in your brain at the moment, thinking, why is that such a simple question? And what's odd about that question? Well, there is something odd about that question. It's one of the questions that's used to illustrate the difference between thinking fast and thinking slow in Daniel Kahneman's book of the same name. Which I commend to you as one of the things you should look at if you're trying to improve your decision making in complexity. Our brains are very, very likely to take the lowest or the easiest course, like water. We look for the easiest problem. We don't look for complexity. We are not aware that something is complex. Now, most of you will have figured out there must be something complex about that question, otherwise I wouldn't have asked it. But I'll leave it to you for a moment. But one of the interesting things is that I can show the way your brain foxes you very quickly whilst you're still thinking about the previous question, is that look at that illustration down at the bottom. Look at that little picture of the stumps as Viv described it. It's an impossible picture, and we can see it's an impossible picture, so we can see that our brain is deceiving us. It's trying to pretend that that's a three-dimensional picture when it's obviously not a three-dimensional picture because it's an impossible picture. Now we can see that. We can see an optical illusion working. What we can't see is all the errors of decision making, all the errors of picking up the wrong data, all the errors of approach in our day-to-day decision making. We need to actually really carefully inject ourselves, vaccinate ourselves against that. And it takes time, and it's not a game you can play yourself. You need other people to challenge you. You can't do this alone. And that's why we run things like the CFO Leadership Academy, by the by. Incidentally, the answer to that question is how much does the ball cost is 5 pence. And again, you figure it out. Most of you are going to be financiers. So finally, I think it's about vision, unity, analysis, and courage. That final question, courage, is about taking your chances, and I realize that we probably flipped over courage in time, but essentially it's the courage to be wrong. When you're making that final decision, it's not necessarily going to be right, in inverted commas. The complex situations you're dealing with, there's no solution to them. It's just that you move to a better place, but sometimes it takes years to figure that out. So that requires courage. So vision, unity, analysis, and finally the courage to make the final decisions. That's what's required when you're making decisions under uncertainty. A couple of things to remind you. We're starting our CFO Leadership Academy on the 9th of September. And the other one is the article which I referred to in the last workshop as well, but it's still relevant today, which is about vision and about flexibility and some of the things indeed that Benjamin was talking about. So, Viv, that is my thoughts on the subject.
Thank you very much, Brendan. That was great. I am just going to we're just going to move on to a period of hopefully of some questions and discussion, just to take us through the next few minutes. If you haven't, just please do send some questions in if there's anything you'd like to put to the panel. And just before we move on, just to tell everyone, the webinar is being recorded and it will be available to view on the CIPFA YouTube channel in the next day or so. So if you missed any of the content, or if there's anything you'd like to review, or if you want to share it with a colleague, you'll be able to do so then. Okay, so just to sort of kick some ideas around with Benjamin and Brendan, perhaps just some reflections on lessons learned so far in COVID, and from both of you, about what's. I mean, obviously you talked about the Nightingale hospitals, but Benjamin, just some thoughts on
yeah,
the last sort of 100 days, or whatever it's been, 120 days. I don't know.
I mean, I think we've seen the best and the worst, and actually that's not really trying to be judgmental, although those words are judgmental. That's in the interests of learning. The best examples have been where people have taken the barriers away, and spend controls are going to cause us some pain. We know that now, but we did think certainly in local government that that was going to be covered. But more importantly, the permissions and the things that were supposed to be barriers to home working, to joint working, to integration of health and social care, have sort of. I have a consultant working with me who spent 20 years integrating health and social care, and he achieved more between Tuesday and Thursday the week before Easter in creating integrated assessment and processes than he'd achieved in those 20 years. So we see all of that, and we see the best examples where we're actually, as public services, learning from citizens and looking at how we can add value to existing systems. Where we see problems is, on the one hand, with too much attempt to give freedom without enough constraints and clarity and vision and thinking about the implications. So some of that has been assessed to discharge process, where that's probably contributed to the crisis of COVID in care homes. Some of that has been spend control and procurement, where a necessary loosening of the controls has also stacked up some problems for the future. And then there have been examples where we've been too controlling, and we've stomped all over. We've caused community organisations to disperse and separate because we asked people who've been keeping their neighbours alive for weeks with picking up their prescriptions to do criminal records bureau checks and ask them if they were fit and proper people to be handing out medicine. And it was all working, and then we came in with our systems and our controls and our community hubs and killed off the natural ecosystem. So I think we've seen examples of walking that line really well, and we've seen examples of failing on both sides of the tightrope. And again, I think we should be very cautious about. There are some things we should probably judge, and I think there will be a public inquiry, and I hope the public inquiry is about learning how to do better in VUCA conditions, more than it is about blame.
Brendan, anything you'd like to add in?
Yeah, I mean, I agree all of that with Benjamin. I mean, that's the essence of the article I wrote in April, is that we gave people lots of freedom, and now we've got to work out which bits not to give. And I was talking to a group of people 2 weeks ago who were in a regulatory environment, regulatory organisation, and I was just observing that nobody had died and as a result of them not regulating at the moment. And so the degree to which we need to think about, well, what regulations do we need to put back in place? How do we need to regulate? Those kind of things I think are going to be big. And of course, then the people we were talking to, they were saying, well, yes, this is all very well, but our political masters will say that we have to go back and put everything back in. So there's obviously levels of communication. I think Benjamin was talking about it before. It's about how quickly that communication goes from the bottom upwards as well as from the top downwards. Will the people at the top get the messages that actually it's not necessary to do the things that you are actually in policy terms wanting us to do? in the way that you want them to be done, they could be done completely differently. And whether or not that happens, because of course the other implication is that if we don't need a lot of regulation, for instance, or if we need much less or cleverer regulation, why do we need all those people doing it?
Brendan, I just went to Public Finance Focus to look for your article. What's the name of that article for people who are wanting to look it up? What's the title? Sorry.
It's on the end of the slides, isn't it? Somewhere.
It's in the learning section. It's called. I think it's called Senior Leadership in Crisis Situations or something like that. And it's
on the previous slide, I think.
It's on the learning. It's on the learning.
That's the one. There we are. It's on the Public Finance Focus or whatever.
It's on the learning.
Senior Leadership for Crisis Situations. Yeah. I'd like to say that I didn't choose that title.
That's my fault, probably. I said at the beginning of right at the beginning of this webinar, when I was just doing a brief introduction, that VUCA could, we are in a VUCA situation. I mean, is that right? Would you say? Is COVID, or are we always in a VUCA situation in the public sector? Or
I'd like to get involved in this, and I think Benjamin said right. I mean, it's a military term, and I'm ex-military myself, fantastic. I still work a lot with the military, brilliant. But it's a limited thing, and actually, if you look at different sets, I mean, complexity, which is the C in VUCA, actually covers volatility and to a certain extent uncertainty, and uncertainty and ambiguity are actually characteristics we give to information, which are external in another set, if you like, called human beings' way of thinking about the world. So we've got two sets: one of the complexity innate in the situation, and secondly the way that human beings think about the world. So it's not it's not a helpful term particularly. It must have been great for whoever wrote their PhD at the War College 20 years ago. But actually, what we need to be thinking about is this is an enduring point. It's gone back, as Benjamin was saying, it goes back years. As I said, I just because it's one of those things you do is I read Basil Littlehart's Why Don't We Learn from History book in lockdown, and I recommend it to everybody because it has so many interesting little snippets about 100 years ago and 200 years ago. People were in exactly the same positions, because this is what government and politics is about. We will never get agreement. We will always be having the situation changing, and the trick is always to work out which are the straightforward parts of the problem and which is the more complex, more difficult to tackle part of the problem, and to use the right approaches, but never to lose sight of the fact, as my diagram right at the beginning does, which is there'll always be a bit of blue in with the red, or a bit of red still in with the blue. You can't separate them out. You can't build the Nightingale Hospital and say we've solved the problem. The Nightingale Hospital is an aspect of a wider problem. And it's only by looking at the wider problem do you have any route forward. And the final point to make, sorry, this is a long point, is you don't solve a type 2 problem. You move the situation on, which is what we do in a political world. We move the situation to a slightly better place, hopefully, but it could be a worse place. And that's where the courage comes in, because you have to make a decision which might turn out to be bad in the end. And sorry, my final point is that I think it's somebody said, in the middle of any kind of change, it always looks like a mess. And that's what it's always going to be like.
Benjamin, do you have any?
I couldn't have said it better myself, and I'm afraid it's slightly disappointing. I hope our guests are not disappointed that we're in vehement agreement on all of these topics. I think we're all saying the point is not to obsess about the VUCA. The point is to work out what you can do about it. A spiritual leader once said, the bad news is you're falling through space with no support and no visibility. The good news is there's no ground. So we're becoming more and more aware of both of those aspects of complexity that Brendan talked about. The complexity that's inherent in the world and the situations we find, and the complexity that's based on people's perspectives, levels of understanding. and we have to get better and better. There's no excuse for not orienting ourselves to be able to manage that. We can get better at it, and things can convert from the complex domain to the merely complicated domain. Look at the science of crowd control, of evacuations from large stadia and concert venues and things like that. It used to be thought that was fundamentally irreducibly complex. We got better modeling, better understanding, better experimentation, better analysis, and now that is a solvable problem. But new, more complex problems keep emerging because that's the nature of the world, the nature of people. Just, you know, the point is, it's human learning and the ability of humans to absorb and deal with variety and complexity that is what we need in place to save us in all of these these challenges.
And just perhaps one final one to kind of wrap us up. I'm sitting here in a small room in my house, and I think everyone, probably Brendan and Benjamin, you're in your own homes as well. How much has the fact that we're kind of home working and the disruption that we've been having, how much is that kind of interfering with all the kind of learning that we need to do? And if when things, you know, once the worst of the pandemic is behind us and we're for something a bit more like normal, you know, I think no one's necessarily expecting it to just snap back to the way it was with everybody going into the office. So I wonder if you've got any thoughts about how disruption to how people work and where people work and how people communicate is going to sort of,
I'll pick this up
threat.
quickly to start with, if that's okay. Yeah. So I think that actually we're coping incredibly well with that. Everybody who I'm engaged with and I'm seeing, I do think that really this is something that we need at the moment. I think people are coping well, and we're building a lot of learning. We've jumped to digital incredibly fast. One of those things that could never be done, but has now been done yesterday. I think it's worth noting, I'm working with some people on kind of OD people plans for coming back, whatever that means, as you indicate, after the pandemic, if there is an after. So all of these things are still uncertain. People have moved from 5-year plans to let's think about what we're going to do in the first 6 months, whenever that starts. So that's an indication of the level of uncertainty. I think we have to be aware that there is a stored up well of all of the normal human emotions are going to be sort of turned up to 11. What do I mean by that? I mean, there's going to be people who were true heroes and really able to handle cognitive complexity and get out there and deal with stuff on the front line, who may have been quite junior staff, who now may be asked to go back into a junior role. We're going to have a lot of people reconsidering their lives, retiring, people who've sat it out, people who are suffering from severe trauma, from death of relatives and from illness themselves. So all of the normal things we have to deal with in terms of our people systems are going to be exacerbated because of the time that we've spent at home and isolated and separated in tasks, and we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to handling that. And Brendan said human challenges, social challenges, as well as VUCA challenges, don't get solved. You just resolve them. So I think that's something to really pay attention to, Viv.
Okay, Brendan, do you have anything to add on that?
Just for the sake of an argument, I'd say that the other thing we need to think about is actually it may well become the new normal. I mean, I personally have worked from home for 20 odd years, and although in the last, I don't know, well, let's just say probably in the last 20 odd years, I spent probably, you know, half my life on the road, internationally or across the UK. So that's changed, but the opportunities to learn, the opportunity to interface hasn't really changed. I mean, the office is a boring place for lots of people. And what everyone moans about the office all the time is interruptions. Well, you haven't got any interruptions now, so there's more time in a way for some people to do things, and I'm sure that people are actually in some ways becoming more productive. And the final thing is I'm going to send Benjamin a photograph, if I can find it, of a Gloucester Meteor, which was the British jet that was created in the Second World War.
I did know that was I noted the tail markings.
Messerschmitt, which I think is probably not the right picture we should have in on this presentation.
That seems fair. I'll happily accept that. I want to make the point that
there's a bit of controversy.
Well, for another bit of controversy, Brendan's right, of course. However, keep in mind that some people I mean, some people are experiencing domestic abuse at home and very, very serious things. And on the other hand, just in terms of the human normal distribution, there are some people who just want nothing more now than get back to their cubicle, back to their coffee mug, and back to their morning commute, and all of those things that a lot of people think are boring and frustrating, and we can easily do without with the demise of offices. But some people will want that back.
Okay. On that note, I'm going to bring the webinar to a close. I want to thank our two speakers, Brendan McCarran and Benjamin Taylor, again for two really great presentations and some really interesting discussion, even if there was a high level of consensus. To say again, we will be making the recording of this webinar available on the CIPFA YouTube channel in the next, if not tomorrow, then certainly early next week. So you can check it out there. You can share it with colleagues, and we'll be tweeting it out on the CIPFA social media account, etc. And slide deck will also be available. We can email those out to registered participants. But thank you again for joining us, and check out the CIPFA events tab for other webinars coming up in the series. Thank you.